Welcome to Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor.
And I'm John Perry. We're coming to you from the studios of KALW San Francisco.
Continuing conversations that begin at Philosopher's Corner on the Stanford campus.
I got a problem there, Ken. I looked around Philosopher's Corner for you this morning, and you weren't there. And I'm looking around the studio, and I can't find you here. Where are you?
I'm in Washington, D.C., John, at the seat of power.
Wow. Is this part of some Stanford coup to take over the levers of power?
Well, not quite, but I am talking truth to power tomorrow. I'm going to participate in a symposium called Legislating Values, Setting Priorities for the 109th Congress. I'm going to be a co-symposium with Joe Lieberman, Jeff Sessions, Adrian Woolridge, and it's moderated by Mort Kondracki.
Well,
so it'll be fun.
That's incredible. Those guys should be proud to be on the same panel with you, Ken. But are you going to be able
to
you going to be able to regain your humility by the time you get back to the Bay Area?
Yeah. I'll be all right. So what's our topic today? Enough about me. What are we talking about today?
We're talking about genetic determinism, the role that the genes play in determining who we are and what we're all about.
Well, that sounds like a cool thing. I mean, you say genetic determinism. I learned when I was way back in high school biology, there's a genotype and the phenotype. I know you like distinctions. Help me with that distinction first.
Well, that's an important one. Your genotype, that's what you get from your parents. That's what comes in the form of DNA, and that determines what your genes do and what your genes are like. And that's fixed and doesn't change no matter how much education you have. I suppose surgery or something like that might change it, but no matter how much education you have, no matter how cultured you get, like in your case, no matter how many trips you make to Washington, your genes don't change. The phenotype, that's what you're like on the outside. 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head. Last time I looked at you, that seemed about right. The color of your skin, the color of your hair, the phenotype, and how intelligent you are, all those things. So the question put in those terms is, to what extent does a genotype determine the phenotype?
And I guess if you're a genetic determinist, you think, well, the genotype strictly, directly, inviolably determines the phenotype somehow. I mean, and if you're not a genetic determinist, I guess you think, well, the environment plays an important role. So you could, I suppose you could be an environment determinist so that the environment did all the work, or you could be a genetic determinist so that the genetics did all the work. Those seem like extreme views to me, both of them.
Yeah, those are 2 extreme views. The more interesting views, of course, are the ones in between. Now, you could have a view that the genes do a lot and the environment is kind of like an amplifier. It's like the tune of the music is fixed, but you can turn it up or turn it down. So maybe you've got your intelligence gene, and if you're raised in Sandusky, Ohio like you were, you end up fairly intelligent. If you have the same gene and you're raised in the wonderful city of Lincoln, Nebraska like I was, you just turn into a regular genius. So that would be an intermediate position, but it's still pretty much on the genetic determinism side.
Yeah, the interesting thing to me about this is that people talk about genes for this and genes for that all the time, willy-nilly. I mean, there's a genius gene, supposedly, a gay gene, genes that will make you more prone to criminal behavior. It seems to me that if you start thinking of genes for this and genes for that, then it's a pretty small step, at least in the popular imagination, to genetic determinism. Because what would it mean for there to be a gene for this or that if the genes didn't have this major role in making you this or that?
Well, I think that's the way the dialectic goes. Few people say, I'm a genetic determinist, but a lot of people talk about genes for this and genes for that in a way that implicitly relies on some form of genetic determinism that may or may not be plausible. Now, luckily, we have with me in the studio today, John Dupre. John Dupre is professor of philosophy of science and director of the Center for Genomics in Society at the University of Exeter in England. He's the author of Human Nature and the Limits of Science and Darwin's Legacy. John, welcome to Philosophy Talk.
Hello, John.
So, John Dupre, it's Ken Taylor here in D.C. Can you help us with this talk about gene for this and gene for that? What does it really mean to say that there's a gene for this or gene for that?
Well, I'm afraid there's no simple answer to that question. I expect you're used to not having simple answers.
No, we like simple
Okay.
answers.
Well, you won't really get one. I sometimes like to say we shouldn't really talk about genes at all, that there aren't any. But at any rate, there are very different kinds of things. And partly that's because of the history of genes. Genes started before anybody knew anything about DNA or anything like that, and they were hypothetical causes of differences in phenotypes. Then we found out about DNA, and people thought we'd found the genes. But actually correlating bits of DNA with causes of differences is a very limited project, and the relations are enormously complicated.
Now, I've heard that they've discovered that there's a gene for Down syndrome. Is that true? And what does it mean if it is true?
Well, pedantically, it's not true because Down syndrome is a chromosomal irregularity. You just have a whole extra chromosome. But that's there is the best case for talking about genes for this and that is genes for diseases, genetic diseases. The only problem with that is you're not talking about a bit of DNA that causes you to have a disease. What you're talking about is one of many possible things that might be wrong with the genome that will cause you typically not to make a protein you need, that will have lots of negative effects on your health. So it's basically something that's wrong with you.
But see, here's something I think I learned a long time ago, and tell me if it's completely wrong-headed. I learned a long time ago that there's something we call the genetic code. I mean, that means there's like a language of the gene, right? The gene encodes these directives. You will be gay. You will be brilliant. You will be a sloth. And it says these things. It's like a computer program, right?
Sounds a lot like my
directives. It gives these directives, and then the development is executing these directives to make you this thing or that. But is it just wrong-headed completely to think that there's a language of the gene and that the genes encode for certain traits and not for others?
Well, I think it's completely wrong to think that genes encode for anything like the examples you give. I mean, the problem is the genetic code is actually something very basic in the mechanics of the cell. It's a relationship between sequences of molecules in the DNA and sequences of elements in the protein. And that's, and there is, in that sense, there is a genetic code. That's what the term means in biology. But the notion that you can spell out, that you can translate this into properties of phenotypes is just on the whole wrong. You can identify some syndromes that go wrong when you have identifiable defects in the genetic sequence. I mean, for example, some of the things we think of as much more causal causal things that produce phenotypes actually turn out to be a bit like that. I mean, blue eyes is my favorite example. People think there's a little thing that makes blue eyes and a little thing that makes brown eyes. But blue eyes really are a kind of defect in the genetic code, which fortunately doesn't do us much harm. Now we can buy sunglasses.
I'll just tell you that John Dupre has brown eyes, and
but some of my best
friends,
some of my best friends have blue eyes.
Oh well, that's good. But look, John. I mean, this can't be right. I mean, you must be exaggerating, or whatever the opposite of exaggerated, exaggerating. Anyway, look at noses, right? I mean, people have different kinds of noses. There's kind of flat noses and hooked noses and little cute upturned noses, and they run in families. And clearly that it has nothing to do with education or culture, surgery sometimes, but that doesn't that come from the genes? Mustn't there be a gene that says that people with my mother and my father get a gene that says this is the kind of nose you'll have?
Well, firstly, I would say that it mostly comes from the biology, and it mostly comes through inheritance. But even then, I'm reluctant to say it comes from the genes, because I think there's a lot more to the biology than that, and indeed a lot more of the biology is inherited. But it may turn out that if you knew enough about the genome, you could predict the shape of somebody's nose. That's a scientific matter that I'm not committed to taking a position on.
So there's nothing incoherent about the idea that this phenotypical trait nose size and shape could be at least largely determined by the genetic code.
Yeah, I should say, I don't think there's a question really here of coherence. I think it's a question of empirical fact. And as a question of empirical fact, there are many different things as well as features of the genome, I try not to say gene, that determine features of the phenotype.
Okay, Ken, I've got this guy to the nose. You want to take the next step?
Yeah, I want to go back to the idea of a genetic code because I just want to make sure I understand something. It sounds as though you think the genes don't code for these, let's call them very high-level features of a person or an animal. It doesn't say you will have a crooked nose or you will have high intelligence, right? But you did seem to allow that they code for amino acids or chunks of protein, right? And if that's right,
I could qualify that, but yep.
Don't.
Okay, but go on. Suppose that's true, and I suppose there must be some genes that time the this gene will produce that or that this or that amino acid, and then there's some other genes that control the timing of the articulation of these things. Well, couldn't somebody say, yeah, they're all right. The genes don't say you will have a high intelligence, but because the proteins work as they do, and because they're released in the sequence that they're released, there's a pretty direct path, somebody might think, from the gene, in many cases, from the gene to the high-level phenotype. Because how does the phenotype get there? By the chemicals in the body, interacting and doing their stuff.
Okay,
what about that, John?
Yeah, give us a couple of examples of the kind of thing you're interested in, or the kind of phenotypical thing that you want to...
Well, any kind of thing. I mean... height,
height,
propensity
weight,
to get fat.
intelligence.
Some people are intelligence, disposition to criminality. People cite genes for. We're still on the genes for idea, which seems to me, tied up with this genetic determinism. And I'm trying to see exactly what John Dupre thinks is wrong with it.
Well, look at genes for height, because that's pretty well studied. Particularly by plant biologists, not so much by humans. In humans, but. So what you find is there are lots of parts of the genome, lots of them, that have an effect on height. And it's a statistical effect. The effects may or may not be additive. That's to say, they may interact with one another in complex ways. So there are a lot of genetic parts. There are a lot of parts of the genome that affect height. There are also lots of parts of the environment that affect height, and lots of other biological or internal features of the organism that affect height. So you can say there's a technical meaning of gene for height, which means here is a gene that statistically affects the probability of being taller or shorter than average. Now, if you want to, in that sense, there are lots of genes. There are lots of health genes we're discovering like this. Lots of genes that increase or decrease the probability in current environments that you will have a particular disease at some time in your life. And those are what medical geneticists refer to as genes for example, deep vein thrombosis. That's when we're studying at Exeter. It increases quite a lot. It magnifies by about 5 times the probability of a deep vein thrombosis. So it makes it, you might have a couple of % chance of having one. But it hardly causes it. Most people never know they have it and never have a deep vein thrombosis.
So you're saying, and it sounds right to me, but see if I understand you correctly. Even if we could find some coherent sense in the statistical way for the notion of a gene for X, right, there is no really direct argument from that notion of gene for X to anything like genetic determinism, right? So that's just a pure mistake to argue from the notion of gene for X to we are thereby determined by our genes.
Is that the right way that's right. That's right. If you want to use the word gene for X in a kind of quite wide-ranging way, then you can't get any sort of determinism.
So in its most appropriate use, gene for X means something like a gene that in a normal genetic situation and in a normal environment will increase, perhaps ever so slightly, the chances of having X. It doesn't mean if you have the gene, you're going to have X.
Yes.
And it doesn't mean if you don't have the gene, you're not going to have X.
Absolutely.
Now, there's a tendency of people to think of genes, even if they grant that genes only cause things in cooperation with the environment, people tend, at least in the kind of popular imagination, to think of genes as really big deal causes, right? That if something,
Yep.
all these studies about the heritability of things like IQ or criminality, and people read that stuff and they shudder and they think that there's not much we can do about it because genes are really distinctive kinds of causes. They're not just one cause among others. And part of that distinctiveness goes back to this code metaphor. I think it's like the genes have state, what you shall be, and the other stuff comes on, helps the genes unfold. It's like in a computer. If you say, here's the program, you say, well, it can't run without a lot of help. Well, yeah, it needs a compiler or an interpreter, but all the compiler and interpreter are doing is sort of living out the mandate of the genes. I mean, am I right that people think of genes as these big deal causes because they think of them as programming us to be a certain way?
Let me add my 2 cents in here before we give John a chance to answer. That is, look, I mean, for a ordinary non-biological kind of guy like me, the genes determine that I'm a human being and not a monkey, or at least they have a large part. Now, nothing about my education is going to give me fins. Nothing you can do with a monkey is going to make it a language user, or if that's controversial. Nothing you do with a dolphin, well, that's controversial too. Nothing you do with a dog is going to give it, make it stand upright and walk around and have thumbs like we do. So for a lot of things that are very basic, what kind of animal you are and how intelligent you are within these very big things, genetics are absolutely determinative. So where does the picture break down?
Well, where's the inference there to genetics? I mean, there are lots of things that make a dog a dog. It's got to have dog genes. It usually has a dog mother and a dog father. It gestates in the uterus of a female dog, subjected to all kinds of doggy chemicals there, and then it gets raised by dogs with dog siblings. I mean, there are lots of things about the development of a dog that make it into a dog. Genes are essential, but they, again, and this comes back to Ken's thing about a specially big cause, a sort of super duper kind of cause. I think, I don't want to say genes aren't important, or at least the genome isn't important, but I think we exaggerate it. There's a particular history to this, I think, which is what was originally ironically called the central dogma of molecular biology, and then it became less ironic and more dogmatic, and we're finally seeing that it's also just wrong, which is the idea that information only comes from DNA to RNA to proteins. And in fact, it turns... Sorry,
go ahead, John. I'm sorry.
No, and it just turns out that that's wrong. I mean, what the DNA does is constantly affected by what else is going on in the cell, and actually, the cell even modifies the genome in all kinds of ways to affect what's expressed there, and so on, and even in ways that are heritable and passed on sometimes to offspring. So, I think we need to see the genome as much more interactive with other interesting determinative things in the cell. So I think the dog cell is what you need to get to be a dog. And if you start off with a dog cell, you'll end up being a dog, if anything.
So it sounds like there's kind of...
John Dupre.
Yeah.
So you're this central dogma that you called.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the thing I learned, I think, when I first learned about evolution in college, is that what does the parent give to the child? Right, it just gives its genes. That's all that's passed on. So all this other stuff that's necessary for development, it has to somehow be there, but it's not inherited from offspring to.
You could make an argument that this is a curiously sexist doctrine, because it's true it's all the male parent gives more or less, though there are a few other bits and pieces, but the female parent gives a whole cell, and there's a hell of a lot of stuff in the cell that isn't DNA. And in fact, we're just beginning to discover how interesting the RNA. There's recently experiments on inheritance of RNA that enables organisms to re-edit their DNA from grandparental RNAs. At least that's what it looks like.
So this conversation has gone from dogs to dogmas and now to feminism. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're discussing genetic determinism with John Dupre, author of Darwin's Legacy. Coming up, we'll hear your comments and questions. How much do you credit or blame your genes for the kind of person you are? How much do genes matter? We'll take your calls Right after the break, Philosophy Talk will be right back. David Bowie and the Gene Genie. This is Philosophy Talk. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. We're talking about our genetic information. How much does it affect who we are? How much do the genes make the person? Join us by calling 415-841-4134. That's 415-841-4134. Or you can send us comments at philosophytalk.org. We'll try to get your emails on the air, too.
You know, if you go to our philosophytalk.org, you can also press the right combination of buttons and go to the Philosophy Talk blog. And we do have an email that shows some people are doing that. This is from Francisco Valete, and he says, how about modifying it to Cogito Ergo Blago? We now have Cogito Ergo Blog. I wondered if that wasn't a little bit of a Latin faux pas. Cogito Ergo Blago, Blago, Blagare, Blagavi, Blagawi, Blagatus,
Okay,
I guess. Okay, so we'll have to consider that.
Obviously, you flunked Latin.
I'm glad Francisco is trying out our blog. We're here talking to John Dupre about his views on genetic determinism. And, John, I see that you're director of something called the Center for Genomics in Society at the University of Exeter. So you must think that the gene and genomics has something to do with society. You want to tell us what?
Well, perhaps I just start by saying it's very important to me, at least, that it's genomics, not genes or even genetics.
So you want to explain that to us?
Well, I think that one way of interpreting the history since we discovered what DNA was and that it had something to do with genes is to see a really quite different sort of science developing, which is a science much more focused on the totality of the genome, much less focused on the idea that there's some little bits of it that have some special relations to bits of phenotypes. And I think we're making much better progress with trying to understand the whole thing in a somewhat more holistic way.
John, can you clarify that a little bit? I mean, so it turns out there aren't very many genes in the human genome, right? There are only like 25,000 or something by the latest estimate, where people thought there were something on the order of 80 to 100,000. And it turns out that a lot of the DNA is what they call junk DNA, and that only something like, 2% or something like that, where a gene is supposed to be a bit of the DNA that actually codes for a protein, right? I mean, so when you say you want to study the whole genome, are you talking about all the junk DNA as well, or what are you talking about?
Yeah, I think it looks increasingly likely that a lot of the junk DNA has functions either developmentally or evolutionarily. We don't understand that terribly well, but I think, yes, that's certainly true. On the question of the small number of genes, this comes to one of the many different interpretations of gene. When genome sequences say there are 30,000 genes, what they mean, roughly speaking, is there's a something that says start transcribing and something that says stop transcribing, and in between that they call it a gene, and even that's very hard to identify, so estimates vary by many thousands as to how many there are. But what's interesting is when you look at gene meaning something like that, then there may be several hundred different proteins that are produced somehow or other from that bit of sequence. So the relations between the genes. So it's not as it shouldn't surprise us anymore that there turn out to be quite few of these, because there are many more proteins than there are, in this sense, genes.
Stephen Jay Gould says that after the results of the Human Genome Project were announced, he said it was a great philosophical moment, the discovery that there were so few genes, so few genes making us. He thought that was philosophically profound. Can you tell me what he meant by that? I mean, why is that philosophically profound to discover that we only have 25,000 genes?
Well, I have to say, I think perhaps he might have overstated that, but it certainly spelled the end of the notion that you could just look at, somehow break up an animal or an organism into features and find the gene for each of them, and so kind of assemble it in this sort of one-to-one way, because there were surely too many features for the number of genes. I think, I'm not sure that many people really thought that, but it made it very clear that there was something quite different going on.
We're talking to John Dupre about genetics, genomics, society, and all sorts of related issues. You can call us at 415-841-4134. That's 415-841-4134. And somebody who has called us while she drives across the Bay Bridge is Fern. Fern, are you on the phone?
Yes, I am.
What's your question?
My question actually is, I wanted to address earlier, one of the commentators was searching for a word when they were saying that the author, forgive me for not remembering the name of this book, or the person who's being interviewed, was somewhat trivializing they were looking for the word, the opposite of exaggerating the role.
Yeah, that was me. What's the opposite of exaggerating the role of genes?
That's you were trivializing it.
Trivializing.
And how can you possibly say that when you look at populations? Let's just take people and dogs. All right, purebred dogs. They're yes, they're beautiful, and they're they have perfect spots, the Dalmatians, and however, a huge percentage of them are predisposed to deafness. I can just go on and on with different animals. The German Shepherd with hip dysplasia.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
But with people, certain people, for whatever social.
So Fern, I mean, just make it clear, you're not a real fan of purebred dogs.
Yeah, I actually. I have my first one.
Oh, I see.
Of a lifetime of. However, mutts are healthier.
Mutts are healthier. I mean, that's the point you're making about purebreds.
And you think that shows?
Also, but this applies to people too. When there's a smaller gene pool because people have been forced to live together, say the Jewish people, or if they chose to live just among themselves, there's a smaller gene pool. They're predisposed to just a whole host of maladies.
Okay, well, that's a good
Fern,
question, Fern. I mean, America is a land of mutts, and I'm one of them. John Dupre is an Englishman. Maybe he's a little more of a purebred. But how about these issues, John? I mean, where does the genomic revolution of the present put us with respect to some of the misuses and abuses of genetics in the past with respect to humans and right now with respect to dogs?
Wait a minute. I think the question, I think the underlying question is an argument that John Dupre was underestimating the power of genes because his argument can't take account of the benefits of genetic diversity or something like that. I mean, that's what I heard Fern's question as. John Dupre, what do you think about that?
Well, earlier in the program, I did talk about what I thought is one defensible use of the word gene, which is the use of talking about genes for genetic disorders, for genetic diseases. Now, I think it's pretty well understood why genetic diversity increases health, and that's because the smaller the gene pool, the more likely you are to get two copies of the same defect in your genes. And so this really is genetics. And I certainly don't want to. It's fairly standard, well-established, kind of old style genetics, and none the worse for that. But I certainly don't deny that if by genes you mean there's quite narrow usage of errors in the genome that cause health problems, then these are important. A great deal of medical genetics is about them, and certainly we'll go on studying them. I think that when we move to genomics, we're starting to get more interested in normal development, how people develop when they're healthy.
So John, let me ask you a question that comes in from the email. It's from David. And it says, I would like to ask Dr. Dupre's opinion of Dawkins' notion of the selfish gene, i.e. that selection takes place at the genetic level and perhaps only at that level. I mean, that was a very important phrase and backed up by an important book. How has it withstood the test of time and your intellect?
Well, I'm not a fan of this particular view of evolution. and I suppose one reason for that is that I think that the concept of gene that it depends on is itself very inadequate. I mean,
so maybe explain a little bit what Dawkins' original claim was.
Okay, well, Dawkins thought that evolution simply was the accumulation of more successful genes, and that the only kind of really important factors in evolution were alternative genes that were more or less effective at getting themselves into subsequent generations.
So we don't say survival of the species; we say survival of the particular genome or
what Dawkins originally said was survival of little bits of DNA.
The real specific genes.
No, specific, smaller than that. DNA consists of these 4 different nucleotides.
Has he backed away from that?
Well, the trouble is that the problem he got into with that is people would point out, well, actually taking, the logical extension of this is that the ideal gene is a single nucleotide. And this is not really, you can't really make any kind of content to your theory of evolution, just a selection of single nucleotide alternatives throughout the genome. But I think the problem is that he needs a functional conception of gene to do any work in showing how these things.
What do you mean by a functional conception?
Well, I mean
of gene?
something that does something. I mean, so you've
Right.
got to get a functional bit of the genome. I mean, and there are lots of ways we could say what sorts of function these could be. I mean, they're like being transcribed into a little fragment of a protein, or regulating the transcription of another.
But
bit of DNA.
John Dupre,
Yeah.
but Dawkins, I mean, has written lots of stuff since the selfish gene, and the way I kind of understand at least one stage of his view, one of the things that people reacted to was the idea that he was somehow a genetic determinist. And he says he's not a genetic determinist. Genetic determinism is silly. He is what he called a genetic selectionist, right? That selection operates on the genes because, he argues, that the only thing the parent passes on to the child are its genes, and so selection can only see the genes. Now, he grants that the path from the gene to the phenotype is really complex. That's development, but that's not selection. And he thinks he has to argue that because acquired traits aren't passed on. So whatever happens to the parent, most of it doesn't get passed on to the kid. Only the genes get passed on, and then development has to take off. But from the point of view of evolution, it's a black box. I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, it's complicated stuff, I know, but
Well,
Dawkins' views aren't simple.
Yeah. No, they're not, and I think. And certainly, I do completely disagree with the gene selectionism, which is the core of the view. One thing is, it seems to me plainly false. If you look at humans, things happen to us that we pass on to our children. I mean, when I learn a great deal more about genetics from this discussion, I can go home and talk to my son, and he will understand genetics better, possibly. Now, that's one form of parental transmission of phenotypic traits. But also, I mean, where you started this, I mean, I said this earlier in the discussion, we don't just pass on genes, we pass on cells. And cells are very complicated things, much more complicated than genomes.
Let's hear from Amanda in San Francisco.
Hi. I wanted to try to find out the difference here between having, like, say, one parent has a genetically inherited predisposition from his parents for depression, and my mother has for anxiety. And both me and my brother, my only sibling, has both the anxiety and depression, but then also the environmental factors of how we were raised, and possibly which factor is really the more inherently important factor that would cause possibly a predisposition towards having anxiety or depression.
Okay, John, I mean, you probably are not an expert on depression. You don't look very depressed. You're a very jolly guy. But when you hear the term gene for depression, what do you think about?
Well, as you rightly guess, I don't know. I'm not an expert on depression, and I'm not an expert on any genetics that may be understood on depression. I think the caller raises a very crucial point here, which is that when we talk about inheritance, particularly human inheritance, it's often extremely difficult to sort out environmental factors that are passed on and genetic factors that are passed on. I'm certainly not going to offer an opinion in this case, but I think it's absolutely right to realize that an awful lot of information we see, or suggestions we see about the inheritance of particular characteristics, actually makes it very difficult, leaves it very open what the mechanism of inheritance was.
I suppose next you're going to be telling me that my grouchiness isn't genetically determined, but is something over which I had some control, but I'm not going to listen. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're talking about genetic determinism with John Dupre. Coming up, genes and freedom. Are we free to be whatever kind of person we want to be, or doomed to carry out the destiny of our genetic programming? And if genes make us who we are we culpable for what we do? Philosophy Talk will be right back.
Or does the water get him instead? Nobody knows. Particle Man.
They Might Be Giants with the song Particle Man. Wow, brings back memories of the times we used to gather around the old radio and listen to They Might Be Giants and all their great songs. Or does it? I'm John Perry, and this is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything
except your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor. You can join us in our discussion of genetic determinism by calling 415-841-4134. That's 415-841-4134. Or you can send us an email to comment@philosophytalk.org.
Our guest is John Dupre, author of Darwin's Legacy. Before we ask John some more questions, I'm going to read a couple of emails that have been coming in from all over the world. First, Pete in San Francisco. Aren't we overlooking the dramatic genetic alteration like the kind we find in genetically altered food, corn, rice, etc.? Can't these have profoundly dangerous results? And here's one of my favorite emails of all time. This is from Claire. I love your program, and I'm glued to the radio today. Thank you for dispelling the gene myths that one usually hears in mass media. Everyone I know thinks that I'm a lunatic when I say things like the knick-knack collecting gene is rubbish. It reminds me of the idea that Plato once had in the Republic about creating a myth for gold, silver, and bronze souls so people would accept their situation in life. People laugh at the notion, and yet the majority of society are almost angry if you tell them that they are not determined by their genes. Thanks again. I love your show. Well, thank you, Claire. We're glad you're listening.
We love that kind of praise, Claire.
Ken, you got a question for John?
Yeah, John. Those two questions illustrate something. The one question was about kind of genetically engineered crops and how dangerous it is to screw up with the genome because all heck will break loose. And then the other one was this is all a myth. But look, suppose we grant that genetic determinism is false. What follows from that? I mean, you think genetic determinism is false. Does that mean just anything goes, that we can be whatever we want to be, that there aren't any constraints on our human nature? I mean, what follows from the kind of view that you endorse?
Okay, well, certainly not that. I mean, I think that we're quite constrained probably in what we can be in the short term, and things make us what we are to a considerable extent. I guess really what I'm saying philosophically and biologically is that we need to shift from an excessive focus on the genome and move on to think about development. And I think many biologists, even most biologists, would agree. Sequencing genomes is a useful bit of background information. Figuring out what they do, what role they play in a much more complex process of producing organisms is really the challenge, the much deeper and more interesting challenge. And that includes us, where clearly the range of factors involved in our turning out one way rather than another is absolutely enormous.
So,
Well,
so-
that's going to be about your last comment, John. Our guest has been John Dupre, professor of sociology and philosophy at the University of Exeter, author of Darwin's Legacy, What Evolution Means Today. John, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, John.
It's great to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Thanks to all who called in. We apologize. There were a lot of people waiting online that we didn't get a chance to speak to. We appreciate your calls. As always, you can join. This conversation keeps going on. I've already put a blog entry. I hope John Perry will. I think John Dupre will. Go to our blog, theblog.philosophytalk.org. So, John Perry, what do you think today? Are you clearer about genetic determinism's ups and downs?
Oh, I think I'm a lot clearer. As always, Philosophy Talk is my main vehicle of personal self-improvement.
Wow.
First, I got a clearer conception of what a gene is and what it means, if anything, for there to be a gene for something, and how the legitimate use of that phrase is restricted to a few fairly specific cases. And I got a little sense of the difference between this genetic determinism and what we might call sensitivity to genomic factors. John Dupre was very helpful with that. And then we talked a little bit about why it matters, and we didn't really get around to the issue of freedom. We had a lot of callers. We had a lot of interesting things. But what do you think, Ken? You think we're freer because of our genetic knowledge, or
No,
less
I mean,
free?
I think it's a very complicated thing, and I think if we had more time to explore John Dupre's view, it's just that there are more interacting determinants of who we are than just the genes and the environment kind of conceived in a narrow way. I mean, but understanding how the genes plus the rest of nature make us is a hard challenge, and someday we will understand that. But I guess we're out of time for that now.
You know,
Let me tell you something else.
There's a lot
Let me
of
tell you something else.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, if you want, I'll tell you something else. You want to be a philosopher king? You want to control the world? Well, you know what you can do? You can start out with those finger puppets. Right?
Oh, yes.
And you can manipulate the great philosophers of all time. You'll be the king of the heap that way. For what is that? $50. We'll give you
$50. We
those.
only have a few seconds left. The number to call, 800-525-9917.
And a special request from John Perry to all you students out there. Don't worry about the gifts. Send us $25. Send us $10. Then we'll know you're a student, and they'll know that students are listening to KALW in person, online, however you do it. Let's hear from you.
800-525-9917. Thank you so much, everybody.